Okay, so my name is Matt. My presentation is on modern U.S. foreign policy, and as I consider it, disastrous for the world. My thesis is that the United States has a long history of colonialism and imperialism, but its emergence as the world's leading superpower enabled a series of foreign policy decisions that have led to, directly or indirectly, the unjust killings of millions, the stabilization of regions across the globe, and the rise of authoritarian regimes. Where I'm going to start this is the lack of regard for human life in World War II. The reason I'm starting in World War II is just because I view this as the moment in which the United States sort of crosses the threshold from a superpower to the leading global superpower. Um, I think the obvious thing to go here for is the nuclear bombing of Japan. According to the US official statistics, Hiroshima suffered 135,000 casualties, or more than half of its population, and Nagasaki, a city of 195,000, suffered 64,000 casualties. Um, I see this as a war crime and a violation of international law. And I see this as just something that is not acceptable, but it's sort of something that has been justified by many people as a greater good type thing. We see this as like the Japanese were a force that were never going to surrender, so we needed to resort to some pretty incredible means here in order to make them surrender and ultimately save human lives. However, I think that this is overturned by the 1946 U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. If you can see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can, it says right here, and this is from the US itself. It cannot be said, however, that the atomic bomb convinced the leaders who effected the peace of the necessity of surrender. The decision to seek ways and means to terminate the war, influenced in part by knowledge of the low state of popular morale, had been taken in May 1945 by the Supreme War Guidance Council. If you don't know, the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima happened in August of 1945, which means that there had already been plans from the Japanese government on how to end the war prior to our decision to drop a nuclear bomb and kill over 200,000 civilians. I think this is an example of some ulterior motives that have arisen during World War II, where we see the goal of the war not only to stop imperialist powers, but to increase our own imperialist reach. I think this is also, these ulterior motives are supported by President Harry S. Truman, who became the president near the end of World War II. He said, as a senator in 1941, if we see that Germany is winning the war, we ought to help Russia. And if that Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And in that way, let them kill as many as possible. The next thing I'm going to be looking at is what I consider to be pointless wars that just destabilize regions. I think the obvious example of this is the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975. The U.S. involved itself in the Vietnam War in order to stop the spread of communism. The U.S. supported the liberal South Vietnam, and the USSR supported the socialist North Vietnam. From U.S. military statistics and Vietnam's 1995 official estimate of the death toll, approximately 3.3 million Vietnamese and 58,200 U.S. soldiers died as a result of the war. What did this really get us in the end? Vietnam is still a socialist country, just one that now has suffered a very, very vast amount of deaths at the cost of deaths of our own U.S. soldiers. And although the initial goal of the war was to stop communism, a 1965 declassified paper from the Assistant Secretary of Defense outlines the goals of the war as such. 10% is to permit the people of South Vietnam to enjoy a better, freer way of life. 20% is to keep South Vietnam and then adjacent territory from Chinese hands. And 70% to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat. I think this is another example of where our goals here are, our ulterior motives of the war are really rooted in just keeping power and not embarrassing ourselves. Another example of this, I think, is the Afghan-Soviet War and then later just full-on Afghan conflict. From 1979 to 1992, the U.S. provided funding and weapons to the Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan War. The Mujahideen later took power and established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Key members and supporters of the Mujahideen include the founders of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden himself, considering that this was a jihadist organization that we supported in order to stop the communists. The conflict has, since 1978, claimed between 1.4 and 2.6 million lives. And I don't think that this has ultimately resulted in a better Afghanistan at all. The Taliban still controls Afghanistan, and it has been described by NPR as the latest chapter in the country's nearly 42 years of instability and bitter conflict. Next, I'm going to be looking at deposing foreign governments. This is something that the U.S. has loved to do in the past. The U.S. has admitted to, had strong allegations for, or been exposed for attempting or succeeding in regime change for other governments on, according to the Washington Post, 72 separate occasions just within the Cold War. Some examples of U.S. involvement in regime change after World War II include, I'm going to go fast, South Korea, Greece, Costa Rica, Albania, 3 times in Syria, Burma, China, Egypt, twice in Guatemala, Iran, twice in Indonesia, 5 times in Iraq, Vietnam, Cuba, twice in Cambodia, twice in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Laos, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Angola, East Timor, and Argentina, twice in Afghanistan, Poland, Chad, Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, the USSR, twice in Haiti, Yugoslavia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Palestine, Libya, Venezuela. I think you get the idea. This process is often violent, like in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, we supported a group called the Contras to undermine the leftist government, and we instructed them specifically on assassinating judges, on blowing up public buildings and bridges, blackmailing civilians. Or in Chile, the leader, Salvador Allende, who was a self-proclaimed socialist and democratically elected, killed himself during a coup against him that the CIA supported. It is often done to uphold geopolitical and economic power, like in Iran and Syria. It is pretty obvious from our coups in Iran and Syria both times, in 49 in Syria and 53 in Iran, that our goal there was really just because they had oil, and we had companies that benefited a lot from the oil there. It is often done at the price of the citizens living in this nation, like in Argentina and Guatemala. In Argentina, we have put in right-wing dictatorships, just as we have put in right-wing dictators like Pinochet, someone who's been described by many as a fascist in Chile, or Guatemala, where the United Fruit Company, was using exploitative labor practices. The Guatemalan government tried to stop it, and then after lobbying in the U.S., we ousted that government that tried to stop them. And it's often done as against weaker nations that have no means of strongly opposing the U.S., as I think almost all of these nations represent. Um, Here is a graphic from David Vine's book, The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. I'd like to address, there are some people who are supporters of this, or I would say apologists for the US foreign policy that we've enacted, saying, we've maybe done more harm than good, or that I've heard some people say, the US has been top dog, and with being top dog comes a lot of fights. I would, however, say that a vast majority of the time, what we're looking at here is the U.S. Often bullying other smaller nations that have no means of protecting themselves, and it only ends really in the death of millions of their civilians, and sometimes relatively not as large casualties against ourselves or none. We may just get better economic interests, or in the case of the Mujahideen and the Taliban, have it blow up in our faces. For those who say, sometimes bad things are happening in other countries and the US has a responsibility to step in and uphold democracy, I would say that what we are doing here is not in line with someone who wants to uphold democracy, seeing as we often will undermine democratic institutions and democratic processes and install authoritarian and fascist regimes, so long as it aligns with our geopolitical interests. I think if France invaded us in the 60s, and then killed our president, installed a new government somehow, and then we had gone to France and we're like, why would you do such a thing? And then France said, oh, well, the U.S. has Jim Crow. We have to stop this injustice, uphold democracy. I would say that this is something that no one in the U.S. that supports U.S. foreign policy historically would accept. And I think it really just speaks to the fact that we have to accept the sovereignty of other nations in instances where diplomacy is an acceptable means. And I think that this really overall just demonstrates that the U.S. has had a disastrous foreign policy throughout its history.